Good afternoon, folks, and thank you so much for joining us today for sharing leadership in the nonprofit sector. Today, we will chat about the benefits, challenges, and practical applications of shared leadership models to inform how you lead your nonprofit organization. My name is Sandeep, and I am the Manager of Education here at Integral Org. My role is to support your participation today, so you can reach me in the chat at any time. To support your accessibility needs, you can turn on the closed caption feature. It's the double C icon on your Zoom toolbar at the bottom there. The live transcription option will help you follow along today's session. And the closed captioning feature will also be available on the video link you will receive of today's session recording. I'm going to drop some more information about Zoom closed captioning and live transcription in the chat for you now. That has some troubleshooting and some support there. If you're having some trouble setting it up, you can also drop me a note and we can help you figure that out. As always, we will have a Q&A period at the end of today's session, so please submit your questions along the way and we will circle back to them, time permitting. Let's begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that Integral Org is based out of Mohkinstsis, which is the Blackfoot name for elbow. This refers to the confluence of Elbow and Bow rivers that run through Treaty 7 territory. Mohkinstsis is situated in the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, as well as the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. Mohkinstsis is also home to the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5 and 6. At Integral Org, our team recognizes the existing tension between the legal and governance structures that we work within and efforts towards truth and reconciliation. And we accept our responsibility to work towards reconciling this tension. We all have a connection and responsibility to the lands that host our lives, our communities, and our work. With that, I would like to introduce today's facilitator, Mike Grogan. Mike is president and CEO of Integral Org and has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 30 years. He is recognized for his ability to inspire nonprofit organizations to tackle complex issues and create sustainable solutions to organizational and community challenges. Mike is passionate about helping organizations understand the ever-evolving nonprofit landscape and working with teams to build their capacity so that they can strategically respond and adapt. Mike, I am looking forward to this new session on leadership. And with that, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep. I was just reflecting, I've probably been saying in the nonprofit sector for 25 years for the last 20 years. Might want to update my bio someday. So there we go. Thank you, folks. Nice to have you here. Good to see two of you. Well, one of you now. There we go. So there we are. Thank you, Corinne. This is a new kind of session for us. We do lots of work on leadership, but we're doing one on shared leadership was something that I think Sandeep and I talked about last fall. And I said, let's put it out there, and then realized we had to build a session around it. So this is the first time doing this, but this is not certainly our first time thinking about this. And so this is to put some thought out there to hopefully hear from you. We've got some things to talk about, but if there's questions, there's thoughts, rebuttals, whatever it is, this is your time. This is hopefully something that you can take a piece of this, some understanding of leadership in general, then some sharing models. I've sort of changed the topic after you register, which I probably shouldn't do, from shared leadership to sharing leadership. And I'll explain why that is. So today, just a little bit about us. So this is what Integral Org does. So for those of you who don't know us, thank you for coming. We are a nonprofit, much like most of you. Our work is this. Our work is to build the capacity of other nonprofits. We do that in a number of different ways. We do lots of workshops like this for free. We'll sit down and have consultations or clinics or one-on-one chats with anybody at any time. So whatever you got that's on your mind, you need help with, that's what we're here for. And then we do work at a deeper dive level with organizations as well. But a new piece we added a couple of years ago is leadership training. So we've gone through one major sort of cohort of that last year, hoping for another round this year, should the government sort of, participate in their new budget coming up next week. We'll see. But leadership is something that is a part of, I mean, certainly every nonprofit, big or small, no matter how big you are, how long you've been around for. So it is, and for me, it's just been a passion. I mean, I like talking about leadership and nonprofit leadership and what that looks like and what it doesn't look like and how it evolves over time. So I want to set a bit of context about leadership in the nonprofit sector. I think we are a bit of a different beast in terms of how we work and what we do. I do want to talk about sharing leadership and give you two models of how that may look, just touching on them. These are sort of bigger pieces, but to sort of break down this idea of having to disrupt our leadership models and how do we try and do things a bit differently. Some things that perhaps you can think about, some ways that these models might be advantageous to you. In other ways, they might be kind of some cautions, some steps to keep going, and then sort of any thoughts or comments along the way. As we go through this, though, if there's something I'm saying or something that you're thinking, I'd like to maybe just question that a bit, by all means, put up your hand. I probably can't see it, but I'm sure Sandeep will. We will, in the chat as well, just anything like that. We'll have time and questions at the end. I've got some questions in advance here, but this is your time. So this is time for you to think about all those great things about leadership. And just a note of appreciation. I know that running a nonprofit or working for a nonprofit is anything in life is busy these days. And for you to take an hour out of your day to come and spend time with us, that is a privilege, and we certainly do take that seriously. So thanks for being here, and let's chat about leadership. I'd like to start with you because I got no content here, so let's do it from you first. In the chat, if you will, can you give me one word that comes to your mind when you think about nonprofit leadership? One word, put it in the chat. I should probably look at these things, I suppose, as they come up, just so I can talk about things. Put a word that comes to mind. Let's see what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about leadership in this great system. Complex, underpaid, there you go. Dedication, impactful. Tiring, there we go. Service, changing. Cost conscious, yes. Feisty, oh, I like that a lot. Savvy, great words. Mission value driven, jack of all trades. Mixed bag. I like those last two. I mean, that's then we'll talk about here a bit is one of the drivers in, I think, some of this thought for us is this idea of having to be that jack of all trades, having to sort of do a lot of things, multifaceted, dedicated, passionate, all these great things. Thank you for that. I think there is certainly, the list could go on and on forever. But I think you sort of named for a lot of the things that we think about here. Some of the complexities, some of the nuances, some of the good things about nonprofit leadership, that mission and value and passionate kind of side of things. And then just the overwhelmingness, the underpaid perhaps, the tiring part of it. And those are all true. And those things can be sort of held side by side. They're not necessarily cancel each other out. There are tensions within the nonprofit world, I think. When we talk about leadership not as a title, but as a behavior. And there's certainly titles that have leadership, and I use quite a few of them today. But it is our belief that leadership is an attitude, it's a behavior, it is a way of being with people. And that can come from anywhere in an organization. At the heart of it, there's 1,000 or 1,000,000 different definitions of leadership. It is about how you influence other people. So that can come from a lot of different places. That can come from certainly the CEO or the board, wherever it might be. But that can come from a lot of places. So we'll use some titles here that kind of sit at that senior executive model, but this is by no means to limit that, the idea of leadership to just that group. So defining leadership and what makes a good leader has and will continue to change. It's not a static thing. That leadership over the centuries and even the last decades or two has changed a lot. There is certainly no one right answer to how to lead. It's going to very, very much depend on who you are, your background, your culture, your values, your organization, the stage of life of an organization, all the things that probably go into this big mix of a sector in Alberta. So when we talk about leadership, knowing there's no one right answer, there's no one right lane, there's no one right way of being. It is a practice, it is a behavior, it is something that's going to change from time to time over the course of your lifespan and your career, and even from organization life cycles kind of stuff. This is just in a nutshell. We could spend the whole time talking about different theories of leadership, but just for the idea that things do change. Now, a couple hundred years ago or 150 years ago, perhaps the idea of leadership was the great man theory. This was looking at, and it was very much gender-based, and we've probably I would say we moved on, but I have a different opinion of this week. The idea that, that a leader is born, that Alexander the Great or Confucius or some of the great sort of leaders of history years ago, they were born into that role and they were able to solve problems. That was the understanding that leaders are not made, they are born, and only certain people get to be leaders. It's an exceptionalism kind of model. As we probably saw that maybe didn't work as well as we thought it would, we started to think about leadership in terms of traits, not about being born with something, but there's traits. And maybe these traits were something you had naturally or else something you could develop. And a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about leadership, from authoritarian, where you sort of top down, you can drive by the rules, bureaucratic, it's generally a sort of process driven. If you follow processes, you'll be fine, to things like relational leadership. We'll be friends with each other. We'll work alongside each other. Laissez-faire means you just let people do what they want. You can kind of go different directions, and that's a style of leadership. And then servant leadership, where those around you grow because of your leadership. Very distinct kind of ways of doing things. None of us have one style of leadership. There is not one style or structure of leadership that's going to stick with us even from day to day sometimes. There's probably aspects of my leadership. I'd like to see myself as kind of relational or servant-like in my leadership, but there's certainly times when I am authoritarian, and you just have to make decisions. So it does shift. I've been thinking about the great man theory a bit as I sort of pull this session together and think how far we've moved beyond that. And then I thought, well, perhaps we haven't. If you look down south, the great man theory is probably the dominant form of leadership south of the border right now in terms of one of the styles of leadership. So these things do sort of come and go a bit. I think they do play on very nuanced ways over time. And as we think about this, and in all our leadership conversations and sessions, is to think about your leadership. And leadership we construe as the idea of your self-leadership. We think about organizational or team leadership, and then leading a community. So we'll talk probably more today about that sort of middle chunk of the equation there, that idea of leading in a team or leading in an organization, sorry. Just some thoughts to consider that many of our governance and management structures are probably outdated and could be rethought or maybe updated. As Sandeep said in our land acknowledgement, that we understand in Tegalorg that the governance systems and the ways that we build nonprofits have a fairly colonial sort of bent to them. We recognize that's a tension. That's not just in our work, but the whole structure of the sector, funding the sector. There's a lot of pieces there that probably don't fit with some more modern ways of thinking. But as our communities shift, as demographics shift, as the models of leadership shift, as people's thoughts about what meaningful work may or may not be shift, I think we're gonna have to reset our models here a bit. And so this is one way of resetting that model. It's one way of saying, can we think about different ways of doing our work, which is certainly not limited to shared leadership at all. There's a lot of ways to do that. But we do need to invest in it and be intentional about that as we think about leadership, especially coming up. And I'll probably close with this, the idea that I think that the next few years are going to be tricky for us as a sector. So how do we make sure that leadership, however we define that, however we structure it, is well taken care of in this sector? So that idea of leadership development in many different ways is critical to our work. And this is, I think, I'd like to start with the idea of the overwhelming, some of the stuff in the chat was wonderful, that overwhelming nature of nonprofit leadership, that it's complex, it's multifaceted, it is perhaps, jack of all trades, stuff is another one there. That leaders today often feel they're expected to demonstrate the emotional intelligence of a human resource representative, the digital data intelligence formerly associated with the IT department, and everything in between. There's just a lot of stuff that fits into the CEO or executive director or that senior executive role of a nonprofit. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's not the worst thing. I think it's great to have that you are responsible for a lot of things, but it's the overwhelming nature of this piece that is tough. I asked Sandeep to make a slide look angry, to the overwhelming things, all the things that might be on your plate. I'm not sure it's angry enough, but it doesn't have to be angry. So these are just a lot of the sort of tasks or behaviors or ways of thinking or things that you got to do that kind of fit into that senior executive role. And they're not bad things. On a day when things are going well, you think, oh, it's kind of exciting. You get to do a whole bunch of different stuff. And when things are kind of firing, or if you got time to actually focus on 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 of these things, it's not a bad gig. It's when you don't have time to focus on these things and you feel you're overwhelmed, it's going from one dot to the next dot to the next dot and not doing everything well. That's where it starts to be a bit of a problem. And I think that problem is likely growing for us right now. that as the complexity of the jobs change, as the complexity of the sector changes, all these pieces and many, many more are perhaps not as sustainable as we'd like them to be. So this is a piece of research. We'll draw two things from this. Is some of the data. There's all kinds of great research out there on leadership. This is stuff we pulled out of the States. It's really timely, which is nice. That, you know, senior leaders at mission-driven organizations are burning out at shocking rates. So 62% have considered leaving in the last few years. That's a pretty high number. Now, whether they did or not, I'm not sure. It's hard to track turnover in this sector. We've been talking about nonprofit turnover for decades now, I think, at the senior level. And some level of turnover is a good thing. It's not that you want people staying there for 20 or 30 or 50 years. I think there is some level of turnover that's kind of healthy. But healthy in the sense that if we leave when we're ready to leave, or leave because it's a healthy move, not because we're moving away from something. And that's perhaps what we're starting to see, is that the toll that the pressures of leadership are sort of mounting on senior leaders are perhaps growing. Or if they're not growing, that having those in place for such a long period of time is starting to whittle down and erode our capacity. So it's not just that the leader's capacity or their health, I'll talk about their health in a second, but the organizations are less capable of doing their work. So if we're overwhelmed with too many tasks or not enough time or not doing things well, we can't focus on strategy or do those things where we're responsive and agile and being innovative and changing those things, all the things that, some of the things, not all the things that we want to do as leaders, that are kind of life-giving and help us sort of be better at what we do, not just maintain the status quo. So that idea that, are we actually building strong organizations when we're putting too much maybe pressure into, is my audio cutting out for everybody else, or is it everybody else? Oh, thank you, Maddie. There we go. So yeah, the idea that, are we, sort of doing the best for organizations when we're overwhelmed as individuals in this role? So a bit of this, and it's not just that it's a stressful thing. It's not just that we are perhaps not firing on all cylinders. Organizations are there. It's taking a toll on health. So one of the remarkable pieces in this data was that how much nonprofit leadership, the stresses of it, are starting to really affect the mental and physical health of leaders. So, 39% saying that the role I have has played a negative influence on my mental health or my physical health. It gets worse, though, and this is challenging for us because the demographics in the sector are not evenly spread across genders. It is that women, and especially women in BIPOC communities, it's even more intense. The idea that these issues, this pressure plays out on mental and physical health at higher rates amongst these communities. For a sector, overall as a sector, we have about 75 to 25% male to female in terms of using those definitions of our sector. Little less so, certainly at the senior leadership model, but certainly, probably 60-40 at that senior leadership model. If it's harder on women and women from BIPOC communities, that's a challenge for us. This is a very big part of our sector. So the idea that the way we've constructed leadership currently perhaps isn't sustainable and certainly is not healthy for some communities. So this is a traditional model, because we'll talk about this. I'm going to come back to this model. In many nonprofits, and if you have staff or a senior level of staff, I know there's lots of nonprofits that perhaps don't have that staffing level. They're sort of operating nonprofits. The board does a lot more stuff. Today, we're going to talk mostly about this one that has this kind of structure. You have the board at the top, and we'll talk about boards a little bit for a couple of reasons. Because that's where a lot of the authority and responsibility comes from, certainly from the board. But they also play a role in shared leadership as well, I think. That senior executive that has, the overall responsibility for managing and operating the nonprofit, and then staff and volunteers who do a lot of the operational programming and administrative work. So it has this kind of funny sort of shape to this structure. It's kind of three bubbles here, but you kind of the board at the top down to one person, down to everybody else there. And it's that one person, that sort of narrow part of the hourglass that's getting to be kind of problematic right now. I want to talk about boards though. Just to start with, partly because they're at the top of the bubble dot thing there, partly because for two reasons that really fit this conversation well, I think. This is my favorite governance quote, not that I got a huge number of governance quotes that I sort of rank on a daily basis, but I like this one a lot. Boards are unique and curious leadership structure. When I do governance training, I use this quote pretty much every time to start things off for two things. One is that boards are a leadership structure. Boards really are. And we're talking about leadership, it is not just sort of the sort of range or the purview of senior staff people. It is the boards. And boards in a technical definition are the ultimate authority for an organization. Boards have significant power. Actually, they have all the power in an organization, and we'll talk about how they give that power away here. But they only act as a collective, since no individual board member can enact anything independently. Boards very much are a shared leadership model. They are probably the most profound and prolific shared leadership model we have in the sector. We don't ever often talk about them that way, but boards are this kind of unique and curious structure where you're kind of thrown together or put together with some folks who are kind of like you, have a similar passion to you, but aren't the same as you. And I think that is what makes boards either really, really good or sometimes really, really bad. That you're in this power sharing, this shared leadership model with folks you probably don't necessarily choose to be with sometimes. So, but boards are also, and this is the more technical definition of board, boards are the legal and moral, and they have the legal and moral responsibility for the whole organization. You have all the responsibility, all the authority sits with the board of directors. When we talk about sharing leadership, we talk about the mechanisms by which the board has delegated some of that work. And we do that by, next slide, please, Cindy. There we go. This kind of thing, where we have the board at the top there, they have all the responsibility. But for many organizations and those with senior executives, they have delegated some away. And that's usually a very formal process. The idea that saying, we've got all these things that are ours, but we're going to give you as the senior executive some things to do. And there's usually some limits to that. There's some things you should do and some things you shouldn't, some things the board reserves for themselves. So for myself, I have a delegation of authority from my board that says I can sign contracts up to a certain amount, follow the budget, hire staff, do all kinds of stuff. There's some things that are just for them. That's a really good, healthy dynamic. When we talk about changing that model to working with more than one senior executive, it probably gets a little more complex. So I want to talk about two ways we can start sharing leadership. If we're trying to find ways to take some of the pressure off that single leader where it's getting overwhelming, the health and the sustainability of our sector are probably not sort of guaranteed anymore. How do we sort of do that? And there's two ways I want to think about this. So we have all those little dots of the overwhelming nature of the tasks that are out there for CEOs and executive directors to be responsible for. And we got the people, the little stickman people too. And those are the two kind of pieces I want to think about. It's starting with the tasks or starting with the people. And that leads us to two ways that we think about sharing leadership. One is called distributed leadership. And this emphasizes the tasks and responsibilities dispersed amongst many individuals. I'll unpack both these a little more, give you some examples of how they're being used right now. Then shared leadership, which implies a leadership style that's still centralized, but making decisions collaboratively. This is the people side of things. So on one side of the model, we've got the tasks, which we find a way to deal with. The other side, we've got people and changing that side of the things. They both still come together. You still have people, you still have tasks. They're two unique theories and they play themselves out a little bit differently. Just so a matter of terminology too, though, I'm going to use the word CEO and executive director. There's a lot of titles for that senior executive in this sector. So the idea of how we sort of define those things is sort of a bit fluid there. So treat those kind of terms kind of broadly here. Just a little bit of a comment too, though. But this is not the same as team building. One of the comments we've had, we sort of running this sort of idea for a session by folks was, isn't this just team building? And team building is certainly a really important part of nonprofits, every nonprofit, I would argue. But this is a bit different. It's distinct from team building. We can work in a team environment. I think everybody does. And interview anybody for a job and they'll ask what their strengths are. They'll say they're a great team player. Fair enough. Great. I'm sure everybody is. But the idea that it's beyond team building. Team building is really about a set of behaviors or activities that sort of build that cohesion and that working function in a group. When we talk about sharing leadership, we're changing the organizational structure. We're changing the authority in the organization. That's a major shift from team building. So team building is important. It maybe is part of the culture of an organization, but the idea of changing the structure and sometimes the sort of the very in-depth structure of how organizations are run is a little bit different than that. Actually, it's a lot different than that. So distributed leadership. We start with the entry point. via the tasks, which are distributed to several leaders. So we stick all those little dots we have on that page, the angry slide, and say, this is not a way to sort of maybe be sustainable as a nonprofit. How do we start with that? How do we think about the tasks in an organization and give some of those tasks to individual or people? And that group of people, whether it's 2 or 3 or 5, are the leadership team. So you don't have a senior executive anymore. We've taken those tasks and say, we've got somebody who's doing finance, perhaps, somebody who's doing programs, somebody who's doing some of the communication stuff. And you end up with a team model. So functional expertise is a lot of times the way you deal with these things, and the idea of having those folks work collaboratively. So we move in dispersed leadership from one person having a whole bunch of tasks, which may be assigned to people, oversee people doing, to, there we are, there's the board at the top, and you've got a number of people working on very discrete task areas, or perhaps program areas. There's a few different ways of looking at it, I think, here. So we have now very much a team model. How big or how little these teams are, I think it's usually more than 3. You're kind of in a shared model if you're at 3. If you're sort of 5 to 7, it's probably getting up there, 7 the larger end. But you've broken an organization down by all the tasks that are important to that organization, and that the leadership has been distributed to those people. In terms of where the authority would come from, this would come from the board to say that we will give, in this model, 4 people some authority in very discrete ways to do very discrete pieces of work. The part here that's really tricky in all these things is how you manage relationships. I keep going back, go back for a second here, Cindy. It's now you've got a much more complex relationship structure. That traditional model that we had up there earlier is, whether it works really well or not, is pretty clear. You've got the board, which hires a CEO, which hires everybody else, and the reporting structures are sort of inherent in that. Now you've got this sort of mixture of ways of doing things. You've got a board in this model that hires and oversees 4 people. Those 4 people need to interact with each other in some ways, and then everybody else in the staff and volunteers needs to find their lane. So this idea of role clarity and structure is a really, not necessarily a challenging part, but a really important part of defining these things. It takes us out of that mindset where we understand our organization quite simply when we look at organizations that we're used to a model that's not really, it's quite foreign to us. And I think, even when you think back to leadership styles and leadership structures, the idea that there is some comfort from having that single leader, that great man theory, if that's the language that was being used. As much as we want to move beyond that, there is the idea that somebody is in control or somebody's in charge is comforting at times for us. It's hard to say, I'm not really sure about this model. So this is very much it's a changed, it's a sort of way of thinking about the structure, the style of an organization that certainly would really upset, I think, the traditional model of doing things. This is where you see this played out in a few different ways. You see this kind of model played out where you see some organizations that would structure along functional lines. So programs, finance, communication, fundraising, and that becomes the dispersed leadership team that reports to the board. Other organizations we've got one we're working with right now that probably wouldn't call themselves a dispersed leadership team, but very, very close to this, where they have 4 or 5 business units or program areas of the nonprofit or their nonprofit that really have almost no relation to each other. They would do day programs or residential programs or counseling. Those may interact, but in this organization, they're very discrete programs, discrete funders, discrete staffing, run by a director, which is essentially an executive director in each of those areas. So breaking the model down by functional area, by the things you do to run a nonprofit, or by program area, or some of the things we're seeing people work on these things or try these things out. They're labor intensive because you've got not just the functionality of doing your administrative work or your program work, you've also got the relational work, and that relational work folks across the leadership team and up to the board and then down to the staff as well. The other way of starting to think about this stuff is through shared leadership. And shared leadership is starting with the people. It's starting with, you usually have this one person as the executive director or some CEO, moving it to 2. I've seen a model with 3. It's probably about as big as I've ever seen. Even the 3-person one, the organization they worked with, probably didn't do very well in the long term. And there is sometimes a lifespan to these things. There's some organizations that can go with co-executive directors for a long time. Sometimes that doesn't last. Sometimes it's interim. So the idea that we start with taking that singular role here and splitting it into 2, perhaps. And that idea of being compatible and having some synergy in terms of the way we do things. So now we've got the board of directors at the top. You've got 2 people sharing that senior executive role and the rest of the staff below them. How you define tasks in this, it could be similar to we've got some different functional areas. You could do everything together, probably not the most efficient way of doing things. You've got ways of sort of breaking things up into maybe more areas of strength. And that's one of the advantages of, I think, any of these sort of sharing models is you're able to structure your organization based upon the individual area of strength of a leader. It's one of the fallacies of sort of nonprofit leadership is that everybody's good at everything. There's a lot of things that I'm really, really not very good at. And to say that, okay, Mike, this is something you should do and you should do on your own or alone is probably not the best way to do things. If you could have a few different folks saying, you know, I'm really good at this. I'm really good at working with people, really good at managing staff. I'm going to function in that way. Somebody else says, I'm really good at raising money. I'm going to work on that part. So the idea of having a model that plays to strengths, that plays to even more than strengths, to passions, is really, really, I think, a different way of envisioning these things. But again, you have this relationship model, this sort of complex relationship one that is something we'd have to navigate. So you've got a board having to manage and oversee 2 people. You've got staff having to figure out who I'm reporting to. So these are not, again, easy models to put in place necessarily. They are ones that take a lot of design, a lot of sort of internal work to keep them going, and a lot of reevaluation along the way. So just because you get it right once doesn't mean that it sort of keeps going forever. So some examples we'll see of this one. You see a lot of permanent or even interim. You're seeing a number of folks who in the last maybe 6 or 8 months I've come across who describe themselves as interim co-executive directors. So it can be permanent. There's some organizations been around. Youth Central have this model for a long, long time here in Calgary with Penny and Lisa, where you had 2 co-executive directors for years and years and years. And I actually talked to Penny and Lisa before this session and said, what were some of the things that probably didn't go so well for that? And they said, well, nothing. It just always worked really well. I would say that's a bit unique, and I think it speaks well to those 2 fantastic leaders and their relationship. But the idea that these things don't necessarily endure over time. The co-executive director model, I think we see is a bit more, it's certainly interim and it's shorter term. You see this when organizations are going through an executive change. The idea that maybe the executive person moved on, you're in search perhaps, or you're not sure what you're going to do with the organization. It's maybe easier or more sustainable to share that senior role amongst 2 people rather than let one person do it. Sometimes there's a bit of politics in that. You don't want to favor one person over another if there is a search going on or thinking about succession that way. I always kind of cringe when I see the word intern before somebody else's role, because it just means that you're kind of doing your job and at least a part of somebody else's job as well. So whether or not that's sustainable or not. But there are ways we do that. And so there's organizations around town. It's not still common though. In the sort of human service education kind of that side of the sector, I don't think it's really that common these days. Yeah, I'll talk about that. Sure, it could put a strain on budget. There is some things, these are not necessarily cheap ways to go. I'll talk about that and some of the disadvantages here in a second. So yeah, it is, it can last. In the arts side of the things, though, you do see this more often, maybe not called co-EDs, but you'll see shared leadership in organizations have very, very distinct focuses. Arts organizations, you may have somebody who's the artistic director, they're responsible for production, all that great artistic stuff, then a business manager. So yeah, very functional, but you've broken the role that way nicely. Again, skill set oriented, passion oriented perhaps, may fit that well. We're seeing it a bit in geographically separated organizations. Maybe you just can't have a leader in 2 places. You need one in each place. So there are ways to sort of do it on geographic one. So, but it starts with the people, taking that single role. Yeah, co-ops. Yeah, co-ops I think are really interesting in this one too. And the way that co-ops think about leadership or think of operations is not totally from the nonprofits, but it's a different mindset, right? It is the cooperative side of things. We're in it together kind of thing, where there's much more, I believe, a hierarchy and a structure in the traditional nonprofit model. But there's nothing that says we're locked into that. There's nothing that says that the way we've done nonprofit work with structures and ways of being and all these things that need to continue. I'm not saying throw it all out because there's a lot of benefits to these things, but the idea that there are different ways of doing things. And that really is the hope here. How do we rethink organizations to rethink about how they do their work and probably have to do it a little more sustainably and a little better perhaps as well. Some things with advantages here, there are some good advantages to mixing up the model. You do reduce that, you can reduce, hopefully you can, reduce that stress on a single leader. If you can share some of the tasks amongst the team or have a co-worker alongside with you to share that role, I think that does take some of those tasks away if it's done well. That increased diversity of experience and thought. One of the things that is kind of a flaw in the system we don't talk about, that Integral Org, I'm the CEO of Integral Org. A lot of this work we do is based on the way I perceive the world and the way I work. To have somebody else's thoughts or perceptions or ways of being at a senior leadership model is probably not the worst thing. It's going to push me to be a better leader. It's going to push the organization to open up to new things. We put way too much emphasis on the power and charisma, so to speak, of that senior leader. So the idea of opening that up a bit wider is probably not the worst thing. It does provide some sort of redundancy or some covers, some succession. You can take a week or two off as a CEO and maybe not worry about the house is going to burn down while you're gone, that there is somebody else there. Longer term, it takes some of those pressures of succession planning off, and you keep the CEO model or somebody else, going back to a traditional model. So it does sort of, I think, take some of that pressure off. It gives a diversity of connecting points for staff as well. And I think that is the idea that we, I think a lot of us think we're great with staff, and I hope you are, but it's also personality driven, and you're going to connect with people better than others sometimes. So to have more options for folks to talk to connect with, to be a part of the team is not the worst thing. Ideally, too, there's the idea that you should get better informed decision making, that, none of us are as smart as all of us. And the idea that you have somebody else wrestling with decisions, somebody else, thinking through things with you, theoretically, if it's done well, you'll get better decisions out of this whole thing. But it's not necessarily easy. So there's some cautions along the way here. That idea of clarity of roles, responsibilities, you need to constantly monitor that. The idea that these are not, there's quite major change pieces for these things. So we'll talk about merge here. Yeah. The idea that you got to make sure they're well structured. So this isn't something you sort of bolt onto an existing model and sort of slap another name up there on the door and say, now we're co-EDs. There's a lot of pieces in here you need to think through. That relationship to the board, the delegation of authority, who does what, how we monitor 2 employees in that model, or 5, it's in the dispersed model for the board. That's a complex piece. And it needs to be thought out, and you're probably not going to get it quite right the first time. But that clarity of roles, the board needs to know who they're overseeing. The relationship between the 2 or the 4, however it is on that leadership team, is far more complex. So the norms, the expectations, the values, the structural pieces really need to be done. And then how it works out externally and internally. How do people outside the organization know who to talk to? How do the staff know who to work with? So those structure and role clarities takes a lot of time to get right. Probably not getting right the first time, but it is an adaptive model. The pace may be a challenge as well. A lot of times nonprofits kind of work at the pace of the senior executive, and the idea that you may delegate some things, but a lot of major things work with how fast, your boss gets around to reading an email or giving the feedback they promised 2 weeks ago. Well, if you've got 4 different leaders in a dispersed team, or 5 or 2, you can move pretty quick sometimes. And can you outpace the rest of the organization? So that idea of the limiting factor that you've got people can run in their own lanes perhaps, but you don't want 5 leaders running as fast as they can in their own lanes. That's going to kill an organization. So it's not just what you do and how you do it and structure it, is the pace of what you do as well. That's an important thing. Internal efforts, certainly that communication, decision-making, accountability, performance management. You got to again, really think about performance management is interesting here. How does a board do performance management in a shared model? There's nothing out there on that. Those are the things that are probably need to be developed. So when I say these are kind of new models or ways of thinking, they really are. There's not a traditional infrastructure around some of these things that we're so used to in the nonprofit sector. And again, significant time. Significant time needs to be invested in this. This is not an easy model. If the overall intent is to lessen that burden on the single executive to get better decisions, a healthy organization, that does not come without a cost. Some of those may be financial. Notice in the chat there a minute ago saying, yes, if you're paying for 2 co-CEOs, maybe there is maybe some adjustment for not sharing that role, but it's the more expensive model. It really is. There's just no way around that. But beyond also in terms of beyond the sort of the financial component, it's the time. It's the time it takes to invest in those relationships. If you think about the shared model of 2 people doing a co-CEO role, the investment in their time to say, we've got to get ourselves on the same page. It's not just functional, It's going to be relational. It's going to be understanding how we make decisions. There's probably some coaching and support for them. So this is not necessarily a natural way of leading. So the idea of you need to invest in these models and these structures to make them really effective. If you're going down this route, and you don't have to sort of do the whole meal deal where you sort of go from a single model to a source model, there's lots of ways sort of in the middle to start to share some of that power down. But it's got to fit you. These are thoughts. These are ways of thinking about how do we do something different. There's all kinds of different ways of changing leadership in an organization or working with our leaders. But it's got to fit who you are. It's got to fit your structure, your capacities, your style, your mandate for today and for tomorrow. To say that this is not a bolt-on solution, this is embedded, and so be very much the core of your organization. So take a look at really who you are and where you're going, and think about, does this work or not? Is this something that perhaps would fit you? And then take the time to develop it. You also think about who's ready to change in this thing. So we can make a case, and maybe some do or don't. Some people who are in that CEO role have no desire to do this. I would argue that most don't. Whether or not that's sustainable or not, I guess we'll see over time. Boards will probably be fairly uncomfortable with this model. It's foreign to us. It's not this way we're used to working. So that idea of change management, so that idea of, are people willing to change? Are they willing to try something? They're willing to invest in it and make the time, put the time in to do it right. So that change management process is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a while to get it right and a while for people to feel comfortable with it. And then really that design, that constructing of the teams, the processes, the procedures, you won't get it right again the first time. The idea of having this style, the structure sort of, put into an organization is going to take that time to reflect it. Couple of just final-ish thoughts, just to where we're heading with this stuff, I think. And this is just some thoughts we want to put out there just to stir the pot a bit. I don't expect we're going to see a whole bunch of co-executive dispersed team models out there. There may be some out there. Yet my thoughts on why this is probably going to become more important in the next 1 to 2 years, perhaps, for us. One is I think we're coming out of a situation, COVID downturn, perhaps, where perhaps we're not as strong as a sector as we might have hoped we are. And so there's still some lingering impacts for that. But moving into the next few years is going to be really tough. And this is part of our economic analysis. We're looking at things, and we're doing a lot of work on strategies organizations. And whether this comes to be, I hope it doesn't. But I think the next few years are going to be pretty challenging for this sector, from financial systems to workforce to service delivery. As we look at the sort of the upheaval that is already underway and will continue perhaps to be in the economy, that's going to play itself out for the sector quite powerfully, I think. There'll be some things that'll be good coming of that. There'll be some folks who rise to the occasion. I think we'll see some great innovative work. We're also going to see a lot of organizations struggling. And so if we have a chance now, it's probably the time to sort of take that assessment of organization. And leadership is a big part of that. There's lots of parts of organizations that you sort of need to sort of think about how strong are we moving into the next little while here. But that leadership function, not just to assume that we have that leadership structure, that person or the way of being that's going to carry us through. As I sort of been watching sort of hirings and such in the sector over the last few decades, you realize that 15, 20 years ago, you had the approach that you could go to the market and hire an executive director or a CEO. I don't think that's quite as true anymore. I think the idea that people don't necessarily want those roles. I think the pool is smaller. I think the tenure is getting shorter. So the idea that we need to sort of rethink in whatever way it is, whether it's sharing leadership or other ways of doing things, is really important for organizations, and probably more important now before perhaps the storm hits than it will be in a few months from now when things are upon us. So that investment in people, that investment in whatever it looks like in terms of in leadership or structural pieces or mental health, whatever it is, I think those are great investments as we sort of move forward here. A couple of questions. I thought I had 40 minutes of content. No, I said 35. I had 42. What do you know? So there we go. So I'm going to just talk about a couple questions that popped up in the chat here. The idea that, is this a style two nonprofits merged. I think it's really interesting. It is one of those things that it probably isn't. It's probably a really good model. Should one of the senior executives, should both senior executives want to stick around? So we've done a fair bit of work on mergers in the last few years. It's become a bigger part of our work. The governance and legal and strategy part of our work kind of fits that well. In each of those probably 6 or 8 mergers, some of it haven't gone through. There's always been the notion, what drives a lot of it is one of the leaders leaving or about to leave. So you didn't have that tension. And I think in mergers, especially, or amalgamations, whatever it might be, the idea, if you've got 2 people vying for the job, you're probably not going to come to the table very often. If one person says, I'm not interested, I'm leaving, it's a lot easier. But this model, should you have such a way of doing things, I think it's really interesting to say, we don't have to wait for somebody to leave, and maybe you don't even want that. It is to say, yeah, we put it in a co-executive model, even in the transition. You don't have to stick with this model forever. You can you sort of modify it as you go. So in a merger, I think that is that's a really interesting way of doing things. It takes some of that pressure off and probably makes the merger far more successful. One of the things that's hard about mergers is that cultural shift. You can keep that sort of being embedded through the leader of each organization. I think that's really interesting way to do things. One of the things that was asked in the question, I can't read Graham's notes too long. Come on, Graham, shorten those things down. The idea of delegating authority. Who holds, there's a question I had in advance, who holds the liability when you do this thing? And that's why there is that. The liability is always going to sit with the organization. Probably doesn't sit with individuals too often, unless you really do things poorly. But so that delegation of authority, and that's why we spent some time on that. That delegation of authority from the board to 2 or more leaders, it's got to be really well thought out, because they are taking on some of that responsibility. No, they have the authority to make decisions. The responsibility is still going to sit with the board, who is the legal responsibility for the organization. So it's an interesting one. It depends on where it sits, but you've got that responsibility sitting with the board, the authority given away a little bit here and there. Yeah, there's a question about how you do disagreements and how you manage disagreements. And in some ways, it's probably, those are the things where you talk about values and culture and how we make decisions. At the end of the day, I make decisions for Integra Board in conjunction with the CEO. I try to be collaborative, obviously, and do that stuff. At the end of the day, it's kind of, I'm the last word in these things. If you've got 2, I think that's an interesting one. You're going to have to find a way to balance those things out. And if you disagree, what is the process? Those are the things in advance you probably need to think about. The shared leadership, the dispersed leadership model, maybe is a little easier. If you've got 5 people, maybe a simple majority is your thing. Maybe not the healthiest thing if you're always having to do it that way. And those are the things that you probably got to monitor. Is the model still healthy? If we're always ending the things we're in disagreement, we're not aligned, it's going to happen at some point. But if that's becoming more dominant in either of the models, probably the model's not going to work for you. There needs to be some sort of synergies. There needs to be that idea that we're working together and pulling roughly the same direction, maybe in slightly different ways. But if you're having those conflicts in those places where you can't find agreement, probably the model's not going to work for you in the long run. How many should people on the board to help evenly disperse? How many people should sit on the board to help evenly disperse the organization's responsibilities? I mean, size of board, it's a tricky one, right? It's probably, the idea of depends on the organization, the complexity of it. I don't know if the size of the board really determines how you disperse responsibilities. It's the board as a whole, that opening quote. The board only makes decisions as a collective, has no more power individually. So how they choose to exercise that really depends on the type of work you do, the type of board they are, the type of staff you have. So tougher one to answer that way. That's all I got for questions and content. That's everything I got. I got no more thoughts. So unless you have some, type them out, say them out, whatever it might be. Interpretive dance, always good at interpreting those kind of things. Can I speak to the downsides of shared leadership from the people we serve? Yeah. I think that's an interesting one. So I sort of talked really about that sort of board and staff relationship a little bit about the staff, I guess, beyond the senior executives. I think, again, it's foreign, right? So, the idea for clients, ideally you think this is a better way of doing things, but you never know. It may take more time. And so if it takes more time from the executives to make decisions or do their work, that's going to play itself out. If it takes more time from the managers and the program staff to figure out who's who in the zoo, does that take time away? The theory, though, is that you are more sustainable, you are healthier, and you're able to make better decisions. Those should play themselves out at the client level over time. Now, whether or not you see that in day one, probably not. There's going to be a growing kind of pains there in that learning curve. I think for donors, it is an interesting one. So depending on how you structure an organization, not necessarily only the senior executive talking to donors, but sometimes there could well be the advantages of saying, listen, if you're working for major donors, like individual donors, maybe you have somebody else connect with them in a different way. Maybe they have a different personality type, that kind of stuff. So I think it could play a lot of different ways. But it's the uncomfortable nature of a new way of doing things. I think once people sort of get to know you and do things, it's not as important as you think. The idea that they just want to see good work done, I believe that's probably true for most donors and most clients. And how you get there isn't as important as what you do, but it's proving that what you do can be done in a better way. Should the board be hidden and never communicate with volunteers? No, I don't think so. I mean, you need to communicate appropriately with volunteers as a board. So as a board, you do things as a board. So you're not here to manage volunteers necessarily. You've got other folks doing that. So I think communicating with volunteers isn't the worst thing. It's just being clear as to what you're doing. You probably shouldn't be directing them because you work as a collective. You may have people who've assigned that thing, but certainly I think having conversations with volunteers probably helps you as a board. What about a president of the board as one of the co-executive directors? Yeah, it'd be tricky. So you still got to separate that board role, right? So there is that idea. Now, the president can be an officer. The president is an officer role. I'm the president and CEO of Unpack. The president is my title to support the board. The CEO is the execution piece. But my board role, I'm not on the board. I'm ex officio. I help them with their work. So president is an executive, an operating role, certainly can be. If president is a board role as a volunteer, probably not, because now you're blending that line between governance and management or execution quite a bit here. How do you ensure clear roles and responsibilities? I think you build a, you sort of rethink the model. It's written down, it's refined, that clear roles and responsibilities. You can't just assume that everybody knows, and you come back to it over and over again, and you check it to say, it's not to say I can write this with my co-ED if they were sitting here and we're fine with it. You've always got to be checking in with what's being out there for other folks. Apologies. Oh, Rachel's leave. Okay, there we go. I think I got all the questions. There we go. I don't know. I might have to take that one offline, Graham. Multiple different shared decision making across multiple groups with different vantage points. I will probably take that one a little offline.
Great.
That's all I got. Thank you, folks. Thanks for indulging me in that. I like talking about leadership. So there we go. You just sat through it. So way to go. Because I hope you did, if you're still here or not. So I'm going to turn it back to Sandeep. She's going to pitch a few things to you, tell you about a few other things. And if at any time, when I say we're here to support you, that's what we do. So if it's a conversation, an email, a coffee, whatever it is, this is what we do. Our job is to walk alongside you and to help you do what you do better. And you do brilliant work. So it's a privilege to spend time with you. Sandeep, back to you.
Thanks, Mike. All right, folks, before we head out today, we wanted to take some time to talk about our nonprofit leadership development offering, Elevated Leadership. Elevated Leadership was piloted in 2023 and was successfully completed by our first cohort of nonprofit leaders in 2024. This offering was heavily subsidized by the Canada-Alberta Job Grant. So when this grant was frozen by the provincial government in August of 2024, we had to put a hold on this offering. The funding freeze is to be reconsidered this March. So we wanted to give people a chance to learn a bit more about this offering before we started accepting applications. So, Elevated Leadership is a nonprofit leadership development offering that is responsive to you and your organization's needs. Over the course of 5 months, participants will go through 5 full days of learning and explore leadership in the context of self, organization, and community among a cohort of other nonprofit leaders, so your peers. Participants will have the opportunity to better understand themselves as leaders, learn a balance of theory and practical applications, and unpack topics like developing an impactful team, setting strategic direction, communicating organizational impact, nurturing strong relationships, and things like managing change. Elevated leadership is crafted by the sector for the sector. And we're excited to host the second offering with facilitators Mike Grogan and Leslie Tamagi, in addition to guests who are subject matter experts in various areas of nonprofit leadership. We're hoping to welcome your applications come April 2025, though this offering will remain tentative until we know what is happening with the Canada-Alberta Job Grant for sure. The job grant subsidizes two-thirds of the cost for approved applicants, so we are eagerly waiting for that news. With that, thank you so much for your time, trust, and engagement today. We would love to hear your thoughts about today's session. So if you could take a moment to fill out a feedback survey, that would be greatly appreciated. Your thoughts help us shape our education offerings, and hearing from you is how we know that we are on track. So your thoughts, feedback, preferences, interests are all welcomed. We recognize that your questions may require a more in-depth conversation about your organization. For more specific support, we encourage you to access one of our free problem-solving services. This could be a short phone or video consultation or a 1 hour problem-solving session called a clinic. These meetings happen between your team and one of our integral org experts. Clinics and consultations are a part of our mission to educate and support Alberta nonprofits. We're here to help, and you can always find out more about these supports and services at the link I am sharing in the chat now. Integral Org is a capacity builder and nonprofit ourselves. Our goal is to equip you with the knowledge and support you need to do your best work. We work in many core areas, including governance, strategic planning, risk management, legal compliance, financial management, leadership development, and more. And we work with nonprofits at any stage of their life cycle using a multidisciplinary approach to address your most pressing concerns. We're here to walk alongside you in your nonprofit development journey, so please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Our details are on the screen here, also available at that link that I just dropped in the chat earlier. And all of this information, including the recording of today's session, the slide deck, will be emailed out to you in the next day or so here. So stay tuned for that. Thanks again for joining us today, folks, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, folks. Take care.